this year to the applications. Is this something that you think the state should be doing each year, sending out applications statewide, or at least in presidential election years?
Here's the issue. Whatever we do, we should do it the same in all 88 counties. So whether we're going to send them out or whether we're not going to send them out in the future, it should be a uniform policy. And we should look to have uniform rules for all future elections, as well as this one. I believe that it is a good public policy to have absentee ballot requests mailed out, particularly in the presidential election cycle. And the reason for that is that that's when you have the highest voter turnout, and that's when you have the potential for lines at the polls. Because remember, early voting and early voting in person and mail was a response to the long lines at the polls in 2004, in which people had to wait, in some cases, several hours to cast their ballot. And so we put that in place to make sure that we spread out the voting period so that people would have ample time to vote early and thus reduce the rush on election day. That's the intended purpose for it. And I believe in presidential elections that it helps contribute to a smoother election day and voting process, and I would like to see that continued into the future. I think that also a consideration, it should also be a consideration for other high turnout election cycles. But I don't believe necessarily that it's something, when you weigh the cost of doing it, that needs to be done in every election, because I read an article in one of the newspapers recently where it talked about how the cost of elections have increased so much over the last decade. And they're right. And that's a broader question for us to have as a state and public policy makers, is that the more conveniences you provide, you have to understand that there are more costs associated with that. And for some counties, that is a tremendous amount, it's a tremendous amount of money for some of these smaller, poorer counties. And so if we're going to continue to try to expand opportunities, from a public policy standpoint as a state, I think policymakers need to make sure that we account for the fact that there is an expanded cost that is largely borne by the local officials, and that the state, if the state wants to require this, the state should start picking up more of the tab.
And what was the price tag for this mailing?
This mailing was around $1 million. Around $1 million for the first one and a couple $100,000 for the second one.
Is that HAVA money?
It's federal HAVA funds. And so those, we made our dollar. If you remember, while we're talking about this, if you remember when I was Speaker of the House, I appropriated, along with the support of my colleagues in the legislature and the Senate President, $3 million so that we could have early voting in 2008 in every county by mail. And at that point in time, the Secretary of State said that wasn't enough money, and that those voters in all counties shouldn't get those ballots, and they decided not to use it. Well, we did this on a lot less than $3 million, which at the time was supposedly not enough, and we did it for slightly over $1 million. And when we started into this process, people were talking about $3 million, then they started talking about $2 million. But after we really started to work at it and figure out how to get it as done inexpensively as possible, we got the cost down to about $1 million.
Mr. Secretary, of these 900,000 vote by mail requests, how will we track what's coming back to you?
Don't come back to me. They come back to the 88 county boards of elections. I sent it out so that they didn't have to bear that cost. But when it comes back in, it goes back to the local board of elections.
Do they report to you?
And we have been collecting data on a weekly basis, and we will do our best to collect that data and release it to you at the beginning of each week. And we're going to start releasing it on a county-by-county basis so that you can have a little bit deeper look into those numbers. But again, we can't compare it to 2008 apples to apples because those stats on mail ballots only were not kept.
At what point can people quit, or should people quit requesting, or is there a cutoff at the point that they should quit requesting paper ballots and that the board should quit sending?
I don't know exactly if I have an exact date, because understanding we're reliant on a third party here, the post office, to deliver, and I'm not criticizing the post office. They do a fine job. They do a fine job, but you want to give yourself a little cushion on those things. And the rule of thumb on all of this is that if you can start voting tomorrow and if you can request your ballot anytime and everybody got one, earlier is better. But I would say make sure it's in the mail. Make sure it's in the mail the Saturday before the election. That would be
The ballot request?
the ballot. And I would want to, if you were going to request it by mail, a good rule of thumb is to have your request in at least a week in advance. Have it in the mail by the Tuesday before the election, and I would put it back in the mail no later than the Saturday before the election. Although if it's postmarked in advance of election day, it will be counted. But even if it comes in late, so that I want to rest assured that if it's postmarked in advance of election day, it will be counted. But again, we have to rely on the time period that it takes from going from your mailbox through the post office system and back to the Board of Elections. But give yourself some time.
And if you forgot to send it in, and you want to bring it by the day of election day, how do you do that?
You can return it in person to the local Board of Elections. Remember another thing that's important though. Under Ohio law, you're not allowed to possess another person's ballot. That's the law. Matt, am I hitting that as succinctly as I can?
Other than a family member.
Other than a family member. So don't have a drop-off site at your local community center and expect somebody to haul them all down there, because that would be a violation of the law.
Are you concerned with voter fraud at all?
Look, I am making sure that we have a system that makes it easy to vote and that the integrity of our system is intact. Anytime that you have over 5 million people casting ballots, maybe 6 million people casting ballots, you always worry about those anomalies. But I believe our system is set up to make sure that everybody who wants to vote can vote, and that they should have confidence in the integrity of our system.
We've heard about the problems that they're having in Florida with voter registration fraud. Have you seen any indication of voter registration fraud leading up to this election?
It's an important distinction, voter registration fraud from voter fraud, because voter registration fraud does not actually include the receipt or casting of a ballot. All right, so that is an important distinction, and I think sometimes the ears of the recipients and sometimes the way that these issues are heard confuse the two. And in Ohio, we will always have a small number of issues raised regarding those. We have when they've been involved. I think we've sent a letter to one organization that would receive some information about some bad registrations coming back, and asking them to better monitor the people that they employ to do that. But on a widespread basis, we have not seen anything widespread at this point in time.
What was that organization? Was that this cycle?
We can make that letter available to you if you're interested. Just let Maggie or Matt know.
And is this organization, is this an organization that is doing registration efforts?
Yes.
Is this the same organization that's under question in Florida?
I don't think it is. I don't. As a matter of fact, it's not been a major issue. We don't have hard evidence of a systemic problem. That's why we didn't raise it as one, and we sent them a letter asking them that we have received information. We can't speak to the credibility of the information as to what's going on, but we asked them, based on that information, to be responsive to those concerns and to make sure that they accounted for all of the issues that have been raised.
And the problems that you heard about were raised by Board of Elections when these came through?
I don't even know the source. I don't even recall the source of the information. I believe it came through the local boards.